Thanks, everyone. It's good to be here. This is work that came out of our efforts in California to implement an SPM-style metric in the ACS for the state. So this is joint work with Caroline Danielson, who's also a PPIC, as well as Sarah Kimberlin, Mary Beth Mattingly, and Chris Weimer, and Jonathan Fisher, who I owe a drink for not having your name on this slide. I don't know how that happened. Sorry about that. So what I'm going to be talking about is kind of the confluence of two measurement problems. One is things that are hard to measure, which we've been talking all day about, and a population that's hard to measure. So slightly different than what we've been talking about so far today, but hopefully informative. So as I think we're all aware, unauthorized immigrants are a sizable share of the poor population. In my estimates for California, it's about 16% of those who are poor are unauthorized. Of course, they have a complex relationship with government safety net programs, which I'll talk a little bit more in detail about in a few slides. So for measures that are trying to incorporate these additional resources and kind of filling out the picture of resources that families have, failing to kind of account for this relationship between poverty and immigration status or eligibility for programs could lead to some measurement problems, I think, and especially in states with large immigrant populations, which is why in a California poverty measure we've paid such close attention to that, because of course about 20 to 30% of unauthorized immigrants in the US live in this state. So it's especially important also for measurement that does a lot of imputing, right? Imputing program participation or benefit amounts. So we kind of want to get this piece right. I think that there may be other applications of kind of the method that I'm going to talk about for just understanding poor populations, as well as kind of this issue of imputation and getting the measure right. So as we're all aware, immigrant legal status is not reported in detail in most major surveys that we rely upon, the SIP being one kind of exception, which I'll talk about. But lately, a lot of demographers and others have been kind of pushing the frontier, I guess, in terms of how to measure unauthorized immigrants in major surveys like the CPS and the ACS. And that, I think, provides an opportunity for us to do a little bit better job with this kind of special population. And that's indeed what we've tried to do in our California poverty work. And I'm going to show you first kind of the conclusion. Maybe I'm violating the rules of presenting, but this is kind of what we get in the end using our California poverty measure, the SPM-style metric that I'll talk a little bit more about. We're able to kind of identify unauthorized immigrants, and so thinking about how poverty varies under different measures and across different groups yields some pretty surprising, pretty stark differences in conclusions. So in California, we estimate under our SPM-style metric about 21% of people are poor compared to the official poverty measure of about 16%. Those rates and that differential jump in this new measurement is much larger for unauthorized population. If we look just at children in the state, our CPM, we call it the California Poverty Measure, and the official measure is roughly the same. But when you look at children with unauthorized parents, whether the children are authorized themselves or not, the poverty rate there is much starker under both poverty measures. Importantly, hopefully you can see, the pinkish kind of bar at the top is what we look at in terms of the influence just on the budgets of families, accounting for the government safety net programs that in this chart is including just resources from TANF, SSI, GA, SNAP, WIC, school meals, housing assistance, and tax programs. So those programs all together, if we just take them out of family budgets in a static kind of accounting exercise, you can see how much higher poverty rates would be across these same four groups that I showed you on the last slide. So obviously, the percentage point changes due to these government benefits is about the same, but of course, as a proportion of the poverty rate is much different across these groups, which is not surprising, I think, given what we know about unauthorized immigrant eligibility for programs, which let me get into next. So we think about how eligibility for programs varies on lots of dimensions like income, work status, family size and type. For immigrants, it's more complicated because there's the layer of your legal status, how long you've been in the US. It varies across programs, it varies across states to some extent. In addition to that kind of layer of complexity and whether they're able to access safety net programs, most immigrants, unauthorized immigrants in the country are in mixed status families. So a lot of them have citizen or legal resident children, which, because many government programs, of course, are targeted towards children, they may be eligible even though their parents are not. The EITC is a major exception to that because it's you need a social security number to claim the EITC. So even if unauthorized parents are working, they're not eligible for that program. And then in addition, there's evidence that even families with, say, an unauthorized parent with a citizen child may be eligible for certain programs. They're much less likely to participate. In some cases, it's because it may be interaction with a government entity just raises concerns about either the likelihood that they'll be able to get amnesty later, or that they may be detected for some reason. So what do we do to try to understand this population better and to improve our poverty measurements? So this is what I alluded to earlier about, first, the lack of data on unauthorized immigrants. A few surveys, large scale or small scale, ask about legal status. The SIP is one of them. That's probably the biggest. Although, it does ask more detailed questions than the ACS or CPS, which just ask whether you are a citizen or not. The SIP asks more detail about your legal status upon arrival and whether you've adjusted that legal status since you've been in the US. However, there is kind of a large, I would say moderately large, missing data problem there. And then there's the problem that we're left with SIP back to 2008. So its reliability to describe unauthorized populations today has some kind of questions in my mind. One survey source of information, administrative survey, is the SNAP quality control data that Kathy talked about earlier. And I'll return to that. It's one, I think, really interesting and promising source of more administrative data on unauthorized status. And I'll show you a little bit more on that in a minute. So to date, most estimates of unauthorized immigrants in the U.S. are based on this residual method that takes kind of the total number of immigrants in the U.S. based on some large-scale survey and just subtracts the number of legal immigrants known to DHS. And that gets us to these big-scale estimates of unauthorized population for the U.S. and for large states. In recent years, some have started using the ITIN tax filing data, which is the number that you file your taxes under if you are an unauthorized immigrant. And actually, between 50 and 80% of unauthorized immigrants are estimated to actually be filing taxes. So my colleagues at PPIC have done some work trying to exploit that source of data, adjusting it for the likelihood of filing taxes to get a more detailed estimate of unauthorized populations at the zip code level, or county level is what they mostly publish. So that's a kind of a cool innovation, I think. And then there's been a lot of work by Jeff Pissell at Pew Hispanic Center, Bob Warren, whose estimates are now at the Center for Migration Studies, if you're interested, that use this idea of logical edits. So taking large-scale surveys like the ACS and CPS and removing those who, for various characteristics, which I'll show you in, I think, the next slide, are likely to be authorized to work, actually. And then the last method that's recent work by Jennifer Van Hook and colleagues and published through MPI is to impute unauthorized status from responses in the SIP. So impute that to the ACS. And both of those last two methodologies provide, in the end, an individual identifier attached to CPS or ACS data. So what we do in our California poverty measure is, as I mentioned, this is following the SPM methodology, but we're based in the ACS to get all that rich detail for the state that we're interested in. And we fill in the information that's missing from the ACS survey questions on SNAP and other participation using a variety of sources, some other surveys like the CPS, and then also some administrative sources. And Beth will be talking more about our work on that tomorrow. So because we're doing a lot of imputations and assigning benefit amounts and participation in programs, we really wanted to pay careful attention to how we're handling unauthorized immigrants in the state. So what we've done so far is to use this logical edit approach. And I guess it's the next slide that has a little more detail on that. And we use that to kind of narrow down the population in the ACS that is potentially unauthorized, and then we use control totals at the county level from that ITIN data that I mentioned earlier. And then the last step is to exclude those who are individually identified in our data as likely unauthorized from participation in certain programs according to eligibility criterion. So this is what the logical, did I say something wrong? This is what the kind of logical edit process looks like in summary. So we start with anyone who self-reports being foreign-born in California in the ACS. This is 2013 data. It's about 10 million. We then start excluding different characteristics. So if you're also a non-citizen, that cuts it by about 50%. The next steps generally in this logical edit procedure are to eliminate those who, based on when they arrived, what country they're from, look like they are probably eligible for a major amnesty program like IRCA or the Nicaraguan or other programs like that. And then there's a number of work-based criteria that we exclude people from this potential likely, or this unauthorized kind of pool. And those are occupations that require you to be a citizen, like law enforcement, or that are high-skilled, so you might likely be on an H-1B visa or a student visa. And then last, we make an exclusion for those whose spouse is U.S.-born or citizen. And so that, in the end, those logical edits actually kind of cut the population, this kind of pool of folks who could potentially be unauthorized in the ACS, to about 3.3 million. And the estimates from all of those residual sources and others suggest that there are about 2.67 million unauthorized in California. So that's our control total that then we use this county distribution of unauthorized to match to. So that kind of random assignment portion of it, or conditional random assignment at the county level, is actually kind of a small fraction of the kind of process to apply this criteria. So these are some major characteristics of what we end up assigning as likely unauthorized. I like to say likely just as a bit of a caveat. In the California ACS sample, the distributions across region of birth, age, the years since you arrived in the U.S., educational attainment, parental status are kind of what you would expect based on these other outstanding estimates that Jennifer Van Hook and co-authors and Bob Warren and others have looked at, and Jeff Passell as well. So this is all just kind of, I guess, we're all validating each other's approach rather than actually, being sure that we're reaching the truth, because this is just a hard to measure population. We don't really have very many good characteristics to compare to. And one criticism of this method of using logical edits is that a multiple imputation, say from the SIP, might do a better job because it has some information on the dependent variable that we're interested in. So this is where that SNAP quality control data, I think, is really interesting. This is an administrative sample of SNAP households, and what they do is they ask families that are on SNAP about other people in the household that are family members or program unit members, but are not supported by SNAP. And they ask why, and one of those reasons is if they are unauthorized. And so this is one of those kind of dependent variables that we're trying to estimate in the ACS. And this is, I think, the SNAP quality control data is one source that we can have some confidence we're getting something right about kind of the joint distribution between program participation and this demographic characteristic. So about 20% of all SNAP units in California have an unauthorized person. 21% is what we end up with from our logical edit process. Also, kind of I was a bit surprised to find that the overall number, the scale of things, matches quite well as well. So we pooled the quality control samples because they're relatively small, so you would expect some differences here, but around 580 to 600,000 unauthorized folks in either data source are estimated to be unauthorized. And let me keep moving in the interest of time. So what we then do is use this information, these individual identifiers in the ACS to try to better match a few key components of resources for families. One that I wanted to highlight is our SNAP and TANF caseload. We use administrative data from the state of California to try to correct for underreporting in the ACS, or not reporting at all. And if you look at that data, 13 to 20% of cases in the administrative data in California are child-only cases, meaning that the adults in the unit are not supported by the program. One of the major reasons is that they're unauthorized. If you just tried to match that in the ACS, it's like 0.1% of program units. After excluding unauthorized from those units, we were much closer to being able to replicate that child-only caseload. And then we do something similar for matching ITIN tax filing data for the state of California by zeroing out EITC for folks that are unauthorized adults in families that would otherwise be eligible. So these are some ways that improve, we think, our especially the connection between poverty status, demographic characteristics, and program use. In the future, we'd like to refine this kind of flag for potentially unauthorized to be less about work status, which it is kind of now and in the literature is so far, to being unauthorized or ineligible for programs. And then also to focus a bit more on this joint program participation, imputation, and standard errors, something that we keep saying that we're going to work on, just to understand that we're layering imputations on top of each other and have some concern about that. Thanks.